Good evening and welcome to Postmark Filmworks series, Our Bridges, Stories from When. I'm Deborah Cathryn, a Campbell County artist and board member of Postmark. Our regular format for this series begins with a short reading from literature. Tonight's selection will be excerpts from chapters 4, 5, and 6, taken from a biography titled Sergeant York and His People, written by Samuel Kincaid Cowan, a native of Nashville, born in 1869, who was a newspaperman at the time of World War I and its aftermath, and was personally familiar with his subject, Sergeant Alvin York. The copyright date is 1922 by Funk and Wagnalls Company. Sergeant Alvin York, the subject of the biography, was born in the rural community of Pall Mall in what is now Fentress County, Tennessee. And portions of this biography include Sergeant York's own diary accounts of his exploits during the war. Sergeant York was born on December 13, 1887, and died at age 76 in Nashville on September 2, 1964. The family lived on a farm, and his father worked as a blacksmith. The 11 children had minimal schooling, and after his father's death, Alvin assisted the family by caring for the other children and worked as a blacksmith, and, interestingly, drank heavily and got involved in fistfights until his religious conversion in a local Christian church in 1914. He was drafted in 1917 and went to France in 1918. Sergeant York was one of the most recognized and valiant war heroes of World War I and received numerous honors, including the Congressional Medal of Honor. Let us begin. They are a tranquil people with their homes back in the mountains, nearly 50 miles from the railway, with a journey before them over rocky roads and up mountainsides to the other communities of Fentress County. The people of Pall Mall live in the communion and democracy of one great family. The social meeting point of the people of the valley is the general store of John Marion Raines. The storehouse sits by the roadside at the foot of a mountain in the western end of the valley. The men of the mountains seldom hurry on any mission. When they come to the store, if only for a plug of tobacco, they remain with John Marion for a social hour or more. It is rare during the daylight hours that someone is not sitting on the porch, waiting to hear if anything new has happened. For all the news of the neighborhood comes to the store. Alvin was born in a one-room cabin on December 13th, 1887. There were 11 children in all. He lived in touch with nature and could call the birds by their names, knew the trees by their leaves, and was familiar with the haunts of the rabbit, the turtle, and the squirrel. There was one part of the routine of the week at Pall Mall that has interested Alvin York from early boyhood. It was the shooting matches held on Saturday on the mountainside. All mountaineers grew up with a rifle in their hands and knew how to use it. Alvin, with the mountainsides at his playground, grew sturdy and resolute. He had been put to work by his father when first old enough to hold a hoe, to help about the house, pack water, and bring in wood. All of this wrapped hard muscles over a body that was unusually large for his age. His companions began to call him the Big 'Un. A visitor from the city once asked Mrs. York if she did her own work. "Sure enough," the little lady said, "in part of other people's, we had to. To raise so many children and keep them right is a great big job." A number of years went by in the period of Alvin's boyhood when no school was held that he could attend. The school term was only for 3 months, beginning early in July. The progress which Alvin York was able to make in all the years of his school life would be about equal to the completion of the 3rd grade of a public school. He was not sufficiently advanced to become interested in reading and self-instruction before he was called to the Army. The need of an education had not come home to him. There was nothing pretentious about the home in which he was raised. It was but a cabin. The walls were papered with newspapers. That was to keep out the winter's wind. But over the windows were curtains of white muslin, and a scarf of it ran the length of the simple board mantel shelf. And in season, the blossom of some flowers swayed there. It was the love for his mother, his love of his home life in Pall Mall, and the sweetheart who was waiting for him there that called him back after he had gone out into the world and won fame. When Alvin went to war, he carried with him a small, red, cloth-covered memorandum book, which was to be his diary. He knew that beyond the mountains that encircled his home, there was a world that would be new to him. He kept the little volume constantly with him, and he wrote in it while in camp, on shipboard, and in the trenches in France. It was in his pocket while he fought the German machine gun battalion in the forests of Argonne. The book, with its records, was intended for no one's eyes but his own, yet painstaking, using ink. He had headed the volume, "A History of Places Where I Have Been." When he left his home at Pall Mall, he reported to the local recruiting station at Jamestown, the county seat. He was sent to Camp Gordon, near Atlanta, Georgia, and reached there the night of November 16th, 1917. His diary runs, I was placed in the 21st Training Battalion. Then I was called the first morning of my Army life to police up in the yard all the old cigarette butts. And I thought that was pretty hard as I didn't smoke. But I did it just the same. His history tells in one sentence of months of his experience in training with the awkward squad and of his regimental assignment. I stayed there and done squads right and squads left until the 1st of February 1918. And then I was sent to Company G, 328th Infantry, 82nd Division. This was the All-America Division, made up of selected men from every state in the Union, and in its ranks were the descendants of men who came from every nation that composed the Allies that were fighting Germany. In his notes, Alvin records temptations that came to him while at Camp Gordon. Well, they gave me a gun, and oh my, that old gun was just full of grease, and I had to clean that old gun for inspection. So I had a hard time to get that old gun clean, and oh, those were trying hours for a boy like me, trying to live for God and do His blessed will. Then the Lord would help me to bear my hard tasks. So there I was the homesickest boy you ever seen. He was keenly observant of all that went on around him in the training camp. And so accurate were his observations that the officers of his regiment looked upon him as one, by nature, a soldier, and they said of him that he always seemed instinctively to know the right thing to do. Back in the mountains, he had had little opportunity to attend school, and his sentences were framed in the quaint construction of his people, and nearly all of them were ungrammatical. There were many who would have regarded him as ignorant. By the standards that hold that education is enlightenment, that comes from acquaintance with books, and that wisdom is a knowledge of the ways of the world, he was. But he had a training that is rare, advantages that come to too few. From his father, he inherited physical courage. From his mother, moral courage. It was while at Camp Gordon that he reconciled his religious convictions with his patriotic duty to his country. The rugged manhood within him had made him refuse to ask exemption from service and danger on the ground that the doctrine of his church opposed war. But his conscience was troubled that he was deliberately on the mission to kill his fellow man. In behalf of his mother, who, with many mothers of the land, was bravely trying to still her heart with the thought that her son was on an errand of mercy, the pastor of the church in the valley made out the strongest case he could for Alvin's exemption, and then sent it to the officers of his regiment. Major Danford, who was then the captain of York's company, sent for him. They explained the conditions under which it were possible, if he chose, to secure exemption. They pointed out the way he could remain in the service of his country and not be among the combat troops. They brought out many facts about the war that the Tennessee mountaineer had not known. York did not take the release that lay within his grasp. Instead, he thumbed his Bible in search of passages that justified the use of force. So the morning of the 8th, just before daylight, we started for the hill at Châtel Chery. Before we got there, it got light and the Germans sent over a heavy barrage and also gas. And we put on our gas masks and just pressed right on through those shells and got to the top. So you can see here in this case of mine where God helped me out. I had been living for God and working in church work some time before I came to the Army. I am a witness to the fact that God did help me out of that hard battle, for the bushes were shot off all around me and I never got a scratch. By this time, he wrote, the Germans from the hill was shooting at me. Well, I was giving them the best I had. When I seed a German, I just touched him off. The letters written home to his mother during this period show him basically unchanged. These letters, usually 2 a week, were the same as those he had been writing all the while. In them were but few references to himself. It was only through others that the mother learned of the honors given to her son in France. At the beginning of each letter, he turned to inquiries about home. Out of his pay of $30 a month as a private soldier, he had assigned $25 of it to his mother. He wanted to know that the remittances had reached her. 2 brothers had married and moved away. He wanted news of them. 2 other married brothers, while still living in the valley, were not at the old home. He wanted every detail about their crops that told of their welfare. His most valued personal possession was 2 mules. Were the younger brothers keeping those mules fat? Were Lily and Lucy, his little sisters, still helping her with the hard work? Of course they were. And in every letter, there was an inquiry about the sweetheart he had left behind. America was ready for Sergeant York when among the returning soldiers his troop ship touched port, the harbor of New York, in May 1919. In New York and Washington, there were receptions and banquets in his honor. There were ovations for him at the railroad stations along his way to Fort Oglethorpe, near Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he was mustered out of service. And in the midst of all these mental distracting demonstrations, Alvin York was put to the test. He was offered a contract that guaranteed him $75,000 to appear in a moving picture play that would tell the story of his mountain life. There was another proposition of $50,000. There were offers that ranged up to $1,000 a week and totaled many thousands. On these, his decision was reached on the instant they were offered. The past in Sergeant York's life had been filled with hard work and hardships. The present was new, the future uncharted. But to him, there was something in the voices of the people who were acclaiming him that was not for sale. The welcome home for him at Nashville by the people of Tennessee will long be remembered among the public demonstrations of the state. Tennessee has always been proud of the fact that the conduct of her sons in those times, when the nation went to war, had entitled her to the name of the Volunteer State. Alvin was beginning life anew, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross and the rare Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award of his country to a soldier. Several cities offered him a home if he would come to live among their people. Communities, wanting him, selected their most desirable farming sites and tendered them. But he wished to live nowhere but at Pall Mall. So the Rotary clubs, headed by the Nashville organization, raised the fund for the York home through public subscription. And there has been given to him 400 acres. He had asked himself 2 questions. What was the great need of the people who lived far back in the mountains? What, since the world had been so generous to him and lifted from his shoulders the trials of living, could he do for his people? He was trying to answer them. Unaided, he had solved the first. It was education. How keenly, within the few months that had passed, had he realized his own need. The second problem he found more difficult. He recognized that he could do a greater good and his efforts would be more lasting and far-reaching if he proved to be an aid to the younger generation. He asked that no other gifts be made to him, but instead the money be contributed to a fund to build simple primary schools throughout the mountain districts where there were no state or county tax appropriations available for the purpose. Of the fund, not $1 was to be for his personal use, nor for any effort he might put forth in its behalf. Pall Mall was home, and there he permitted no distinction between individuals. This is really a story of but 2 years of his life, a period in which he has done 3 things. And any one of them would have marked him for distinction. He fought a great fight. He declined to barter the honors that came to him. And using his newfound strength, he has reached a helping hand to the children of the mountains who needed him. Reading this biography of Sergeant Alvin York reminded me that those who fought in World War I were applauded, and accolades for returning soldiers reminded me of Tennessee history, in which our own mountain men played such an important part, beginning with the Revolutionary War, establishing our country, and the many conflicts that followed, up to and including today, and the many difficulties faced by today's military families, including the long separations. There was honor for soldiers returning home in the aftermath of our own Civil War on both sides, and in many of the conflicts that were in fact wars, but were perhaps called by other names, such as police actions. But there were many different views of some of the later conflicts. In my own school days, there was Vietnam. Men were drafted out of my college classes and scorned upon their return home after the infamous withdrawal from Vietnam, and some of my acquaintances turned to alcohol and drugs. The public, including me, began to doubt much of what we were told by the media as being perhaps hyperbole or propaganda, and I longed to see Vietnam for myself. At a much later time in my life, I was able to tour the entire country of Vietnam including the infamous Hanoi Hilton, the prison in which John McCain was held captive, and the Cu Chi tunnels, and to meet survivors of the airlift. I have a daily poignant reminder of Vietnam as I use a small tray with a picture of a water buffalo that was given to me by a young man who'd been airlifted to the States as an infant. He grew up in California and at age 18 finally found his mother in Vietnam. His mother had survived the war by selling ice cubes after she purchased a small refrigerator from a Sears Roebuck catalog and was now in business in Saigon with her son selling small gift items. His father had been a member of the South Vietnamese Air Force and was retired and now playing tennis. The young man was so similar to many young men and complained that his relatives were constantly fixing him up with dates to try and get him married, but he was enjoying life as a bachelor. In college, a classmate of mine had been brought up in Vietnam and Japan and said that her father, a Green Beret, had been there for years training troops before our government ever even admitted that we had any troops there. And I lived about 1 hour from Kent State when student protesters of the Vietnam War were actually shot by our own National Guard soldiers. That was a time of protest and torment, not totally unlike today. We each have so many personal memories, and perhaps know several families who came here as refugees. And one of our very beloved Campbell County teachers, who was from Hawaii, and she was of Japanese ancestry, spoke of knowing people who were of Japanese descent being incarcerated in internment camps during World War II. Now is the time when I point out that this program, Our Bridges, Stories from When, is about our stories, all of our stories, not just mine. I invite you to share a story or a letter or a moment from your life that you thought about when I was reading the selection from Sergeant York and his people. Maybe you are thinking about today's conflicts and how each conflict can affect virtually everyone in the world in their daily lives, even in such daily activities as adjusting the furnace, getting heating oil, gasoline for the cars, and electricity. And of the military families separated for many months, or the millions of refugees forced to leave their homes. Your own experiences, perhaps in military service or of someone you know, or even of another kind of war that the entire world has been battling for the last 2 years, the war against COVID. Or maybe this selection reminded you of something else completely. On the last Wednesday of this month at 8:30 p.m., right here on WLAF Channel 12 in LaFollette, we will be sharing the stories you tell. My own include saving the newspaper from the day that Saigon fell in our infamous airlift. We've asked a few friends of Postmark to respond, but we always have room for more. We want to hear your stories. The way to get in touch will be on the screen in just a minute. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Postmark's Our Bridges, Stories from When. This is Deborah Cathryn, Hoping you'll join us next time, and wishing you a good night and good memories.